Germany's anti-immigration alternative is celebrating what they're describing as a historic success this morning. They had a big victory, and it was a big victory for the far right in the eastern regions of the country. They finished far in front of Germany's three governing parties. I'm joined now live from Berlin by Deborah Cole, Berlin correspondent for The Guardian. Deborah, a lot of analysis looking at the fact that this is the first time a far-right party has scored a regional victory in Germany since the Nazis. Is that too florid a comparison?
Good morning, Anton. Yeah, it's not a Nazi party, the AfD, and yet particularly these state chapters we're talking about today are considered to be right-wing extremist by the German security authorities. And so their views are absolutely outside the mainstream, to put it mildly. And, a key difference being, however, is that for now, the Democratic parties have agreed to uphold what they call their firewall. So a pact not to cooperate with the AfD, with the Alternative for Germany party, and help it gain power. So even though it came in first in Thuringia state and a very close second in Saxony, for now, it seems it will not be joining either of the governments.
And to what extent is that rooted in Germany's pre-war history? Because there is a sense that Nazism rose through the democratic process to begin with, and to some extent was facilitated by being coalesced with in its early democratic phases.
Absolutely. I mean, at the bedrock of mainstream German politics since the war has been this notion of, the culture of remembrance and a never again approach. And so built into the Constitution and deeply woven into the political culture is this notion that something like this can never again happen in Germany. And so there really is this consensus that under no circumstances would they, form a coalition, but even there are these models of sort of, tolerance of minority parties and things where support is lent, on certain initiatives and things like that. The firewall, prevents anything like that.
So what is it that AfD has been offering? What's the policy platform that has found this electorate?
Well, I mean, you have various strains running through Eastern Germany, and Eastern Germany really is the former communist East Germany. Has a spirit of sort of disaffection among many, many voters, a sense that, even 3 decades after the Berlin Wall fell, more than 3 decades, that the traditional parties are not meeting their needs. Now, economically, the region has actually seen vast improvements over those 3 decades. And so the differences between East and West are not nearly as stark as they used to be. However, you had things that happened in the 90s and early 2000s that really left their mark, including massive depopulation, that is, citizens moving from the East to the West, particularly women, in fact. And so you had these villages who were sort of, that were emptied out of people, particularly women, and left behind many men who felt quite frustrated, felt like they were second-class citizens in Germany, and don't really buy into the political mainstream as defined by the larger parties on the national level. And so the AfD, these voters are sort of ripe for the taking for the AfD, and also for this new party, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second, that also performed well yesterday.
Well, tell us about the new party, if you would.
Yeah. So Sahra Wagenknecht, she has been in German politics since a very active and quite charismatic figure in German politics since around the time Germany reunified in 1990. And she broke off from the far left Linke party, and in January formed her own party named after herself, called the Sahra Wagenknecht Alliance. And yesterday it scored in the double digits in both state elections, and that completely scrambled the mathematics for coalition building. Now, most German elections end up not producing an absolute majority for any one party. That was the case yesterday. And so after after every election, you need to form a coalition if you want to govern. And essentially, by gaining about 12% in Saxony, and a whopping 16% in Thuringia, she has made herself into a kingmaker. Now, her policies are quite interesting because they are going to make it very difficult for the mainstream conservative CDU to cooperate with her. So, on the one hand, a very far left, hard left economic policy for steep tax increases, for example, for the wealthy and increasing the minimum wage. But then she has this very socially conservative policy as well. So quite anti or very immigration critical stance. And also what many people call a very pro-Russian stance, pro-Putin, in fact. She denies this, but she has called for the end of military aid for Ukraine. Germany is the biggest provider of military assistance to Ukraine in Europe. And she has also called for immediate peace negotiations with Russia, which might sound on the face of it sort of benign. But of course, what she is doing is essentially calling for Russia's gains on Ukrainian territory to become the new status quo.
And to what extent do those policies in respect of Russia and respect of immigration, to what extent do they align with the AfD?
It's interesting. I mean, they overlap quite a bit. Now, Sahra Wagenknecht said last night that she will also maintain the firewall. In other words, she will not work with the AfD, and she is negotiating from quite a position of strength now. So when it comes to German democracy, that is a quite reassuring prospect that she is not going to climb into bed with the far right at this point. But in fact, she does bring those issues, a hardline stance on immigration and this deeply critical stance when it comes to assistance for Ukraine. She drags them into the mainstream now in these parties, in these states. And of course, things like policy on Ukraine are not set by the states, but it is going to change the tenor of German politics over the coming months. And in a year's time, Germany will be facing its next general election. So it will be really interesting to see which aspects of those policies might get co-opted by the other parties.
And of course, we've seen instances around the world where the far right have been able to use things like being firewalled, either literally or metaphorically, as a way to create quasi-martyrdom and use it as grist to their supporters' mill. Is the same likely to happen, do you think, with the AfD as we look ahead to future elections? Is this a growing trend?
I mean, in terms of sentiment, yeah, there are a lot of people saying, including AfD officials, but also voters, that this firewall stance is, in essence, anti-democratic, that it is not allowing voters' voices to be heard and their influence to be felt. However, the greater good that the other parties cite is, the sanctity of German democracy, protection of things like minority rights, and that is embedded in the Constitution. And given the fact that particularly the state chapters of the Alternative for Germany that we're talking about have been branded extremist by German security authorities, then there is sort of no excuse for working together with the AfD. They're going to try to stand up to the party. They're going to try to address more voters' concerns to try to win them back. But speaking from this vantage point today, after this bombshell election, they have their work cut out for them. I mean, I'll just make one last point that, of course, these results didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, they had been predicted for the entirety of 2024, and yet the mainstream parties proved unable to win those voters back, even though they saw this coming.